Hello and welcome to NewsHour. It's coming to you live from the BBC World Service studios in central London. I'm Tim Franks. Coming up on the programme, the US says it's open, Iran says it's closed. We'll look at the latest clashes, verbal and military, over the Strait of Hormuz in about 15 minutes. But first, one of the big figures of US politics, the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, has died at the age of 71. His office issued a statement just saying that he'd suffered a brief and sudden illness. Graham was seen as an old-school hawkish Republican, a senator who backed a pugnacious interventionist foreign policy when it came to Ukraine and to Iran. He was also seen as a close ally of Donald Trump. Speaking on NBC's Meet the Press on Sunday morning, Washington time, President Trump said that he'd spoken on the phone to Lindsey Graham on Saturday evening and had heard the news of his death just a few hours later.
I got a message about 1 o'clock in the morning from one of the people at his office that he had passed away. I said, I just can't believe it. He was like a member of the family to me. It's very tough, actually. He was such an advocate. If he wanted to get something, and he had a unique ability. He was able to deal with Democrats and Republicans. If I had a problem, a real problem, I wouldn't often ask. But if I had a problem with a Democrat, he could work it out. He was a great politician, actually.
It had, though, been a relationship with its bumps, as we'll hear. Recently, though, they had been very close. This was Lindsey Graham extolling the president just after securing the nomination earlier this year to seek a fifth term in office as the Republican candidate for the Senate seat in South Carolina in the forthcoming midterm elections.
I want to start with President Donald J. Trump. I just talked to him, so I know he's watching. Mr. President, when you endorsed me early on, it changed everything. You're the gold standard in the Republican world, the most consequential endorsement, I think, in the history of politics. And when you spoke, the people of South Carolina listened. And President Trump, I'm coming back to the Senate in 27. I'm going to win in November, and I'm going to help you change this world and change this country.
Senator Graham was a hugely experienced as well as influential Washington politician, first elected to the US House of Representatives in 1994 before getting his Senate seat, which he'd held since 2002, rising to become chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. But as I mentioned, the praise you just heard pour on the president wasn't always the tone he struck. In the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump's first victory, Lindsey Graham announced that he'd voted for the independent candidate, Evan McMullin. The senator did then swing behind President Trump before, in the wake of Mr. Trump's refusal to accept the 2020 election defeat and the subsequent invasion of Capitol Hill by his supporters on January the 6th, 2021, Lindsey Graham said, "It's over."
Trump and I, we've had a hell of a journey. I hate it being this way. Oh, my God, I hate it. From my point of view, he's been a consequential president. But today, first thing you'll see. All I can say is count me out. Enough is enough.
But then, as Donald Trump began campaigning for a second term, the pair reconciled again. As I mentioned, Lindsey Graham had a reputation for championing a traditional Republican view of a bold, outward-facing posture for the US in foreign policy. Just last week, he was in Ukraine, meeting President Zelensky.
I'm pleased to announce, as of about 30 minutes ago, we've reached agreement with the White House on a version of the Russian sanctions bill that they will support. It means it's going to become law. So when I get back to Washington, I'm going to go with Senator Blumenthal to the Republican and Democratic leader to see if we can find time to move this Russian sanctions package that would give tools to President Trump to help end this war.
John Bolton was Donald Trump's national security advisor until he was fired during the president's first administration. He was also firmly of the same wing of the Republican Party as Lindsey Graham. So what will he remember of the senator?
Well, it's very sad, obviously, totally unexpected. I've known Lindsey for about 25 years, if not more. Worked with him on many national security issues over that period of time in his partnership with John McCain and Joe Lieberman. Worked with him extensively when I was national security advisor in the first Trump term. He was somebody who believed in a strong, robust American foreign policy because he believed it was in our national interest to protect ourselves and our friends around the world. And it's a voice that will be sorely missed.
He did absolutely represent that traditional strand of the Republican Party, one traditional strand, which was for a muscular American presence in the world. It feels as if that was a bit of a throwback, given the temper of much of this Trump administration. What do you think it was that meant that he nonetheless managed to sort of get the president's ear?
Well, he was very rare in being able to talk to Trump and give him candid advice. He started in 2016 from a position very opposed to Trump, but I can tell you from my own experience as National Security Advisor on questions like Afghanistan and Iran, that he played an important role in presenting what I think is the correct side of the argument to Trump. And Trump himself has no philosophy, so a lot depends on who has his ear. And with Lindsey now sadly gone, that's one less sound voice that'll be talking to Trump.
I wonder what you made of his approach, though, because as you say, I mean, he poured scathing criticism all over Donald Trump in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. Didn't even vote for him. Called him the world's biggest jackass, a race-baiting, xenophobic religious bigot. And, you know, Donald Trump returned the favor, calling him a disgrace and dumb and so forth. But Lindsey Graham ended up being extremely complimentary to Donald Trump. And I just wonder what you made of Lindsey Graham's approach. I mean, effective, but do you think that it came at a bit of a cost?
Well, Lindsey's a politician, and he wanted to be reelected in 2020. He wanted to be reelected in November. It's a mark of Trump's aberrational influence on the party that fewer people in Congress didn't speak up against him when he was pursuing policies they knew were wrong. Everybody's got to make their own judgment of what they want to do. What I can say about Lindsey is that he never let his principles be compromised.
Yeah, although I suppose some people might say, well, one of those principles is you stand up for what matters, and perhaps, you know, what matters is your opinion of somebody and the sort of person that they are. And Donald Trump obviously has his fervent supporters, but he does also have his trenchant critics. And, you know, perhaps Lindsey Graham was willing to swallow that in pursuit of, who knows, I mean, maybe proximity to power.
Or getting reelected. He had a primary opponent in South Carolina earlier this year who said that Lindsey was not a real MAGA Trumper, and Lindsey was able to call on Trump himself to say, no, actually, Lindsey's okay, and he won his primary. He certainly would have won in November. That's politics.
May I ask just one final question, if you don't mind? I mean, I don't think that we've had the chance to speak to you since you pleaded guilty in court about 3 weeks ago or so to the mishandling of classified security information during your time as National Security Advisor. You were awaiting sentencing. That's due to happen towards the end of this year. Donald Trump has weighed in, perhaps predictably, to say hopefully he will be dealt with harshly, speaking of you. If I can ask sort of what your thoughts are at this time, given that this has been something that obviously has been hanging over you for quite some time now.
Well, Trump's comment is typical of the man, but as I have throughout, I just can't comment on the case. I'd love to discuss it at some point, but this is not that time.
And that was John Bolton paying tribute in the main to Lindsey Graham's career. Friday will mark the 90th anniversary of the start of the 3-year-long Spanish Civil War fought between the nationalists, the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, and left-wing Republicans. The conflict may have ended just before the outbreak of the Second World War. The divisions are still being argued over today. High in the mountains outside Madrid stands the Valley of the Fallen, a huge memorial site commissioned by Franco where tens of thousands of war dead still lie buried. For the BBC, William Crawley has been exploring the site and its continuing controversies.
That's the cross over there in the hills. How far away is that?
We must be 5 kilometres away. So it is a gargantuan cross that we can see even at this distance, surrounded by mountains, but the cross stands out very clearly.
But it's apparently bigger than, or taller than the Statue of Liberty. You have this enormous rock, and carved inside it is the basilica itself. And with this enormous colonnaded granite entrance with a sculpture of Jesus and Mary the Pietà above the entrance to it, which takes you into not only the basilica, but what was once the mausoleum for Franco.
Indeed. Franco's remains are no longer there. They've been removed. And then later the remains of Jose Antonio, the Falangist leader, who was buried opposite Franco. Those two tombs, which were the only marked tombs in the entire structure, they've been removed. What remains, it's estimated up to 30,000 corpses or body parts that were scooped up off the battlefields of the Spanish Civil War, and that is what the relatives now want to try and reclaim.
One of the bodies sealed behind these walls belongs to Silvia Navarro's great-uncle, a Catholic businessman, not a soldier. He was killed simply for being a Republican sympathizer.
We found out that the remains had been transferred to the Valley of the Fallen in April 1959 without the consent or even the knowledge of their families.
Silvia wants her great-uncle's remains removed from this site. The current government's plan is to try to change the meaning of the valley by reimagining it away from its original Francoist propaganda. They've already officially renamed the site after the natural valley where it sits, Cuelgamoras. The minister who leads the strategy is also a professional historian, Secretary of State Fernando Martinez Lopez.
Well, the project to reinterpret the meaning of the Valley of Cuelgamuros has been approved. In the valley, as in the whole of Spain, all Franquist reference will be removed.
Not every historian agrees that the Valley of the Fallen should be reimagined. The pushback isn't only academic, it's also coming from the political right. Esperanza Aguirre, who led Madrid's regional government for nearly a decade under the Conservative Popular Party, wants the government to leave the valley as it is.
This is the second biggest basilica in the world. And what they want is to take out the cross. The cross is one of the biggest in the world. And I am, as Catholic, and there are many Catholics in Spain, why do we have to convert that in a museum of the Civil War?
In the end, the valley's struggle to settle its own meaning is really the whole country's struggle to settle its past.
And that report from Spain by William Crawley. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC. Coming up on the programme, the last woman to be hanged in the UK, Ruth Ellis, has been granted a posthumous conditional pardon. When she was executed in 1955, she was mother to two young children. We'll hear from her granddaughter.
You can't even begin to imagine what those two children must have gone through and the impact it had on their mental health. And, ultimately my uncle committed suicide and my mother led a life of chaos. She died at the age of 50. And the ripple effect is still being felt today. It's been 2 generations. We are still feeling the impact of the shame and embarrassment that ultimately we all grew up with.
That interview coming up in 30 minutes. Main headline this hour, as I mentioned early on in the programme, at least 27 people have been killed in a massive fire at a bar in the Thai capital, Bangkok. And the US and Iran have continued to trade strikes over the Strait of Hormuz. This is NewsHour, live from the BBC with me, Tim Franks. Lindsey Graham was one of those close to President Trump, urging to, as he put it, finish the job in Iran and employ America's full military might should Iran continue to be, in his word, provocative. Well, overnight the US launched its third round of strikes after Iran had hit a ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran then attacked US targets across the region, including Oman, and that in turn prompted an unusual protest from Oman, summoning the Iranian ambassador to complain at the assault on its territory. I've been speaking to the Omani international relations analyst, Professor Abdullah Barboud, who's in the Omani capital, Muscat.
Oman has been trying very, very hard to ensure that this conflict is resolved through dialogue and negotiations and diplomacy. Unfortunately, while Oman was doing that, the United States attacked Iran twice. And Iran has developed a very strong lack of trust in the United States and what is going on. So what they have done now is that since Oman opened this corridor, as it were, for commercial shipping on its own water, I think that lack of trust extended not just to the US, but to anyone in the region. And they have their own justifications for doing that. We in the region don't accept it. Oman has been very patient with the Iranians, trying to keep the good neighborly relations, keep the dialogue, etc. But I think this particular incident and this particular episode now has, driven Oman to take a stand and quite a substantial stand. But I don't think this is going to push Oman in any direction. For the Gulf states, they don't want to be part of this conflict. They never wanted it. We want this conflict to be resolved through dialogue, through negotiation, through diplomacy. And I think all the Gulf states, Oman included, will push for this, despite their message to the Iranians.
Professor, you said towards the start of that answer that you thought it was unfortunate that the US had attacked Iran. The US has said that the only reason it launched these strikes earlier in the week was because Iran had itself targeted shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz. Does the US not have a point here that it wants to preserve freedom of navigation?
If you talk to both sides, each one of them will have a point and will have an interpretation of Clause 5, I believe, of the MOU.
Point 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding, which is all about the Strait of Hormuz, and
yes,
which has this line saying the Islamic Republic of Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman. I mean, it's vague, isn't it, that language?
It's very vague. It's very vague. And I think this is one of the issues that has risen, that both sides understand it in a different way or interpret it in a different way, intentionally or unintentionally. For Iran, I believe that they think that they have opened the strait and ships can still go through the strait, but under their control for the 60 days to ensure that there is not going to be any attack. Oman saw it, that since the MOU was signed, that we can now open another, if you like, route. And I think they were encouraged by the United States, perhaps the IMO,
the International Maritime
Organization. And perhaps the Iranians read it, completely different. That maybe Oman is siding here with the Americans or with the IMO, and they're trying to go beyond what we had intended. It's very difficult to judge. There are so many things that we don't understand in this conflict, and I don't think we will ever be able to understand. And the decision-making in Iran is very, very difficult to judge.
And that was Professor Abdullah Barboud speaking to me from the Omani capital, Muscat. Now to tennis and the sound of small furry objects being hit really, really hard.
How about that? How about that? Sweet Sinner.
6-7, 7-6, 6-3.
Another forehand crushed. 4 sets of compelling tennis to finish up Wimbledon 2026.
The moment is brought to you here on the BBC World Service just over an hour ago when the world number one Yannick Sinner successfully defended his men's singles title at Wimbledon. The Italian beat Germany's Alexander Zverev to take the 5th Grand Slam of his career. Zverev had begun the match strongly, winning the first set before Sinner took back control, and watching it all was the former British number one tennis player Joe Dury. Joe, very good of you to join us after what's been a pretty demanding weekend, because you were heavily involved in the women's singles final as well. But what did you make of the game?
Yeah, it was a fabulous match, and it was very well contested. I think Zverev couldn't have played any better than he did in that first set. It was just tremendous. His forehand was just outrageous at times, how hard he was hitting it. But gradually, Sinner, stayed consistently at his level, and Zverev just dipped below. That was in the third set, I think sort of 3 or 4-3 round there. You just felt that Sinner was taking control again, and he was just that little bit too good in the end.
Am I right in saying, heaven knows why I called it a game, of course it's a match, but am I right in thinking, I wasn't watching it quite as closely as you, given that there was a news programme to get on air, but it felt as if the match sort of improved as it went on. I mean, into its fourth hour. I mean, the penultimate point, I think, was the longest rally of the entire match, and it just felt as if it was just all going maybe a little bit too predictably with serve, but then sort of hit its straps.
I think at the end, those last few games when Zverev, he knew he had to raise, his level of play again, and he was desperately trying to do that and get back at Sinner. And some of those points were just tremendous. I mean, they both are such great athletes. The way they slide on the grass. I mean, I never did that when I played. I would have just fallen over. But they managed to stay balanced and get back, and it's going to and fro. But I just thought that, Sinner just had those answers at the end and was a little bit better.
He got a rapturous reception. Most Wimbledon champions do. He won his second championship back-to-back without Carlos Alcaraz, his great rival, who's currently injured. I mean, how, in the sort of pantheon of men's tennis right now, how popular, how big a deal is Jannik Sinner?
Well, world number one at the moment, with Alcaraz slightly injured. I mean, he'll be back in the summer, I'm sure, at the US Open. But those two, I think, are head and shoulders above everyone else. I would put then Djokovic and Zverev, just below them. And then you kind of got the rest of the top 10. So at the moment, Sinner and Alcaraz are the ones to beat. They bring, their game, and the others are trying to find a way to beat them, because what they do is just so consistently good. It's just, it's out of this world sometimes.
Yeah. And just in a sentence or two, if you would, how was the 2026 Wimbledon vintage for you?
Yeah, I thought it was fabulous 2 weeks, actually. There was loads of stories, and got Arthur Ferry, who did so brilliantly and got us all going. Lovely to see a Brit in the semi-finals. But there were plenty of well-contested matches, and that's what you want at Wimbledon.
Indeed. Joe Jury, former British number one, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to NewsHour. Welcome back to NewsHour. 2 records to tell you about in women's cricket even. One to be proud of, one not so much. The source of pride is that India's 22-year-old sensation, Kranti Gaur, has made history as the first woman to earn a place on the Test Honours Board for stellar individual performances at Lord's, the ground in northwest London known as the home of cricket. She did so by claiming 5 wickets during the first innings against England. And the second record, that this was, remarkable to say, the first women's Test, in other words, multi-day format match at Lord's. I've been speaking to the Indian cricket journalist and commentator Onesha Kosh, who's been watching the game at Lord's.
The reason it's significant, of course, this is the first time a woman has gone on to take a Test 5-wicket haul. But it's also historic because of the story in itself. Kranti Gaur comes from one of the most impoverished parts of central India, in fact. And she is an exemplification of that rags to riches trajectory, because she was born in a family which could barely afford 2 square meals a day. She's one of several children to begin with. Her father was in the police but lost his job, which left the family in severe financial difficulty. And then her mother, Neelam, she had to pawn her jewellery to keep the household going and also to support her cricket. And then for this young woman, all of 22 years old, to fox the batters, some of the best batters we've seen in women's cricket globally, that has been the standout. To have that kind of control and efficacy and relentlessness, that has been the hallmark of her success. And That's the reason why she's become the first ever woman to have her name on the iconic Lord's Test Bowling Honours Board.
This is what, the first women's test that has taken place at Lord's?
That's right. It's taking place after 142 years since the first men's test was organized at this very ground. So it is rarer than the Halley's Comet, which, well, happens once in every 76 years. But one can only see the bright side of things, because to have this contest staged here means so much for a format. Test cricket still remains a male preserve, and with this being staged, I hope it goes on to change the narrative to some extent.
Yeah. And what have crowds been like? And indeed, not just crowds at Lord's, but also, from what you understand, the audience back home in India. Is there a lot of interest?
The attendance that Lord's has recorded in the first 2 days, I think it started off with 10,000 plus on day one, and then created a world record on day two, which was yesterday. Over 15,000 people in attendance, which is the highest ever for a single day in a women's test. I personally believe in the philosophy propagated by the great tennis legend Billie Jean King. You can't be what you can't see. So if you cannot see women donning whites and playing red ball cricket, how can you expect the audience, of which the majority is comprised of by male watchers in India, how do you expect them to show up in numbers? So the more it is televised, the greater will be the response from audiences in terms of in-stadia appearances.
And that was Ornacia Kosh. You're with the BBC World Service, and this is NewsHour, live from London. Female genital mutilation, FGM, is, as the name implies, mutilation, seen worldwide as a human rights violation. Nonetheless, more than 200 million women and girls are thought to have undergone the cutting of their genitals. In the small West African country of the Gambia, the practice is particularly widespread despite an official ban that's been in place for more than 10 years. And that legal prohibition is now itself being challenged, with religious leaders and an MP arguing in the Supreme Court for it to be overturned on the basis that it violates constitutional rights to cultural and religious freedom. Fatou Balde is one of those who's been arguing in court against them. She's the founder and CEO of a group called Women in Liberation and Leadership, and she spoke to me from the Gambia.
I was between the age of 7 and 8 when I was caught. I remember I was taken to my uncle's house. I was told we were going to a family ceremony. And I remember I was dressed up. My hair was made nicely. I was very excited to see all my cousins. And after arrival, I realized that we were all put in one long line, several girls of us, at least 10 of us. We were all blindfolded. All I remember is hearing each girl that went in screaming and coming out. And when it was my turn, I was taken into this area where I was pinned down on the floor, and then my genitals were cut. I was screaming. And I remember after the procedure, when I was taken out of that place, when I was carried, I was first reminded that I should never speak about what had happened to me, that if I had explained anything about that procedure, that the old woman that cut me would come back and cut me again. I remember bleeding heavily, and I remember the old women taking some herbs and putting it around my genitals and also covering it with a cloth so that the bleeding would stop. And I remember how painful that was, but also one of the memories that I still have, and I hear this from many survivors, because when the procedure happened is without anesthetic, without any medication. One of the things that is done every morning and evening, you are given warm water and salt and herbs and asked to sit in that water for the wounds so they won't be infected. And I remember that is one of the most painful experiences that I still very much remember. But also I remember being absolutely terrified to urinate, because every time I peed, the pain was so bad when it touched the fresh wounds. But also the physical pain was just one part of the trauma. What really I remember the pain until today was that after I was caught at that age, I was not allowed to be with my mother. I was taken into a room where I was closed for weeks. And during that period, I was told that's where I was being taught what society expected from me as a young girl, how I behaved moving forward. And my grandmother joined, and I remember longing for my mother to be there.
In other words, what you've just described is not just an episode which was ghastly in its own right, but decades of physical and mental trauma that you've had to live with ever since.
Absolutely. And also for me, as I grew older and began to question FGM, I realized that, this is one of the most cruel forms of violence against children. I may be speaking today as an adult, but this happened to children, to very young little girls. And what it does, apart from the physical and psychological harm, it also teaches girls that their bodies do not belong to them, and that other people have rights to control and harm them. And when, for example, in my case, when girls are pinned down on the floor and the most intimate part of their bodies are violated, we are teaching them ultimately that pain and suffering is accepted, especially from people closest to you.
So
Yes.
how widespread would you say that it is at the moment, Fatou?
Presently, the statistics are showing that over 73% of women between the age of 15 to 49 in the Gambia have been caught, and 1 out of 2 girls under the age of 10 have already experienced FGM in the country. But the support for it from survivors is reducing significantly.
Right.
The most recent data is showing that most survivors are saying they do not want the practice to continue. And I think that is an important part.
Nonetheless, there is this challenge in the Supreme Court which claims that, although, as you pointed out, there's no religious basis for this mutilation, but its supporters claim that in the Gambia there should be a right to administer FGM because it's a cultural and a religious right that should be protected under the Constitution. How serious a challenge is this?
It is very serious because the fact that this challenge is mostly led by men, not survivors themselves. It's led by men who've never experienced FGM, who never know how FGM affects women. That shows the regression that we are dealing with. My personal experience of FGM was not one of dignity, faith, or tradition. It was one of fear, pain, and trauma that continues to affect me and millions of girls, not just in the Gambia, but globally.
And that was Fatou Balde, founder and CEO of a group called Women in Liberation and Leadership, speaking to me from the Gambia. In Canada, citizens of its province of Alberta will take the next stage in deciding whether they want to become an independent state, with a vote on whether to remain a part of Canada or whether to hold a binding referendum on going their own way. Both the Liberal government under Prime Minister Mark Carney and the Conservative opposition are campaigning against separation. But those wishing to leave say successive governments have ridden roughshod over the Western province. Talking of which metaphor, the BBC's Nadine Youssef has travelled to the Canadian West to Alberta's famous radio festival, the Calgary Stampede.
It's a celebration of Alberta's history and culture, and of course at an event where Alberta identity is front and center. There's been a lot of conversations about the upcoming referendum in October, where Albertans will have the chance to decide whether they want to stay in Canada or explore the process of separating and becoming an independent country.
I think that the Stampede is an example of the culture here in Alberta.
Teresa Hell, a born and raised Albertan who has lived in Calgary all her life. She believes the values on display here show why Alberta should go it alone.
People believe in getting down and dirty and working hard, and our goal in independence is hopefully to bring that type of value system back into Alberta.
The majority of people we spoke to at the Stampede didn't share this view and supported a united Canada. MPs from Canadian federal parties are using the Stampede to make their case. With a campaign pancake cookout breakfast.
We've talked directly about Alberta separatism today, a poison, I think, that can divide families.
This is Corey Hogan. He's just one of 3 Liberal MPs in Alberta, historically the Conservative heartland of Canada.
You look at the polls and you'll see 70-30 support for staying in Canada, 80-20 support for staying in Canada. But I think we're all very worried that Alberta's politics could be consumed by this forever if it's a little close, and it looks like maybe there's a trend towards separatism.
However, those campaigning for separatism claim that Alberta has long been treated unfairly. They point the finger at the successive Liberal governments of Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney. We've driven north of Calgary through 2 hours of Alberta's vast and sunny prairie to meet one of the campaigners for independence.
Oh, look at all the Alberta flags. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 Alberta flags outside this truck stop.
There you are, sir. Thank you, Chris.
For Whistle Stop owner Christopher Scott, the true break with Ottawa occurred during COVID-19.
I was raised believing that Canada was a free country, and that kind of came to a head when I had the police and health services here threatening me because I just wanted to exist and work and earn a living.
Chris was arrested in 2021 for protesting COVID lockdowns outside his restaurant and was later accused of breaching health restrictions, charges which were eventually thrown out.
Independence in Alberta is necessary and inevitable. You can't go that long with people underrepresented before something breaks.
Separatists spent the last few months gathering signatures for a petition that asked to make the referendum binding. Their effort was successfully quashed in court by Alberta First Nations, who argued they were not properly consulted on the matter. At a neighborhood barbecue in Calgary, hosted by nearby First Nations to celebrate Stampede, the mood is firmly against separation. First Nations land in Alberta is governed by treaties signed between Indigenous people and the British Crown nearly 150 years ago.
We have to fight it. We have to. And so we did.
Speaking to me a few feet away from where one such treaty was signed, Chief Samuel Crowfoot of Siksika Nation tells me there is no clarity on what would happen to those treaties if Alberta were to separate.
There is no guarantee, there is no talk from the separatists, no reach out from any of the movements here to talk with any First Nation as far as I'm aware, about what this new area of Alberta would look like if we were to separate from Canada.
And that report from Alberta from Nadine Youssef. David Willey, who served as a BBC foreign correspondent for more than half a century, has died at the age of 93. He reported from Algeria, Vietnam and China, but is best known for his time with the BBC in Italy, first as the BBC's Rome correspondent and then becoming its Vatican correspondent, reporting and travelling with 5 popes. Here's a flavour of some of David's reports over the decades, beginning with the assassination of the Italian politician Aldo Moro in 1978.
Who's speaking? Red Brigades. This is the voice of terrorism. Red Brigade's terrorist announces to a close friend of the late Prime Minister Aldo Moro that he's been murdered, and he tells him where the family can find the body, just near the Communist Party headquarters in central Rome.
The full scale of the devastation caused by Sunday night's earthquake in southern Italy is only now emerging. In the Naples area alone, more than 3,000 people have died.
Several shots rang out, according to eyewitnesses, and the Pope slumped in the arms of his Polish private secretary. Panic broke out around the Pope, but security men and officials got him quickly to an ambulance.
I've accompanied the Pope on all his foreign trips this year, but normally Vatican correspondents sit in the back of the plane.
So David Willey, a correspondent de la BBC.
Can you describe to me the taste of a truffle? What does it taste like?
Oh my God. The taste is like Chanel No. 5, I would say.
David Willey getting the best out of people. You also heard David reporting on the 1980s Naples earthquake, the attempt on John Paul II's life in 1981, travelling with Pope Benedict in 2010, and then at the end talking gastronomy with an Italian aristocrat. I also remember working alongside David during my visits to Italy as the BBC's Europe correspondent going back a few years now, and David was an absolutely top-class act, professionally and personally. This is NewsHour.
This is the BBC World Service, exploring the effect of ballet classes on young Kenyans.
When I wake up, I have to do my chores, wash dishes, mop the house, and then I come for ballet.
2, 3, 4.
Lydia's childhood has been full of uncertainty, but for her and hundreds of other children living here in Kibera, ballet has remained a constant.
Ballet teaches children body presence, body placement, body awareness. Those 3 components are so key when it comes to growth.
I'm Caroline Kiambo, exploring how ballet is changing the lives of young people.
I use dance to help children realize who they really are.
When I'm dancing, I feel joyful, I feel free.
Kibera Ballerinas. To listen, search BBC The Documentary online or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
And just a reminder of our main story, our top story this hour. The Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a close ally of US President Donald Trump, has died at the age of 71 following a short illness. The former national security advisor to Donald Trump during his first administration and fellow foreign policy hawk John Bolton paid tribute to Senator Graham here on NewsHour.
He was somebody who believed in a strong, robust American foreign policy because he believed it was in our national interest to protect ourselves and our friends around the world, and it's a voice that will be sorely missed.
One other headline story we've been covering: the US and Iran have continued trade strikes as each side makes conflicting claims about the Strait of Hormuz. This is NewsHour live from the BBC, and just an update now on the news that broke in Bangkok just before we came on air, very early in the morning there. A fire in a pub in the Thai capital has killed at least 27 people, according to local officials. A further 63 have been injured. The official said that... one Thai official said that witnesses reported a fire in front of the stage area at the venue, and that fire had already burned through the entire place by the time rescuers had arrived. And it's thought to have started at midnight local time in a bar in the Chatuchak district. Reports say many of the victims were found inside the bar's toilets. Recent television pictures of the burned-out building show firefighters going through a scene that is littered with charred tables and chairs. Now, last week in the British Parliament, the Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy made an announcement about the last woman to be executed in the United Kingdom. Ruth Ellis was hanged in 1955 after she was convicted of murdering her abusive lover. The British government's announcement in the last few days was that more than 70 years on, Ellis had been granted a posthumous conditional pardon. It was said that her death penalty had been replaced with a sentence of life imprisonment. Her family had campaigned for many, many years for a murder conviction to be overturned entirely, arguing that she was physically and emotionally abused by Blakely. Ruth Ellis's granddaughter, Laura Enston, came into our studios and spoke to the BBC's Jane Hill. Laura was in the public gallery in the House of Commons to hear the announcement of this conditional pardon, and she told Jane what that moment was like.
It was incredible. It really was just so surreal. And to hear the support, once the announcement was made, it was just unbelievable. I just can't believe we've managed to achieve what we've done today. It's a really historic moment and incredibly profound for our family.
Talk to us a little bit about that. Why has it been so important for your family? I know you were there with your brother today to fight for this.
This whole thing has cast a long shadow over our family. Ultimately, when Ruth was executed, she had 2 young children. She had a 10-year-old, my uncle, and she had a 3-year-old daughter, my mother, Georgina. And ultimately, I truly believe when that death sentence was handed out, the clock was started on their lives too. You can't even begin to imagine what those 2 children must have gone through and the impact it had on their mental health. And, ultimately my uncle committed suicide and my mother led a life of chaos. She died at the age of 50. And the ripple effect is still being felt today. It's been 2 generations. We are still feeling the impact of the shame and embarrassment that ultimately we all grew up with. And ultimately that shame and embarrassment was all based on a fictitious character. Ruth was portrayed at the time of the execution to be this cold-blooded killer, social climber, all these crazy headlines. And that's the narrative I grew up believing. And I spent 40-something years distancing myself from the story because I didn't want to be associated with that. As a teenage girl, I don't want to be associated with all the things that Ruth had been associated with.
So did you sometimes not want people to know that she was
People did not know. When I started to lean in on this story, when the narrative changed, there was a new book that was published, a drama that was made, the narrative completely changed and I felt completely re-educated. But I had to go around to people I've known 25 years to say, we've been friends a long time, but I've got something I need to tell you.
So some of your friends didn't know?
Had no idea because I just didn't want to be tarnished with the same brush. What we now know is Ruth was on trial for so much more than just murder. She was on trial for her morality. She was really portrayed in a very sort of sordid light. She represented change. She was a single mother. She was a nightclub hostess, but she was doing incredibly well in the face of adversity. She'd been abused by every significant man in her life. She'd achieved so much. And don't forget, this is post-war Britain, so women were really being encouraged to go back to the home and be good old housewives. And Ruth was the antithesis of that. And also how she looked. She was very glamorous, very sort of Marilyn Monroe-esque. She didn't look like the nice conventional mother that the government were really, really trying to push at the time.
You've used the word shame several times already.
Yeah.
I know you say you tried to keep it from friends, but did it impact you at school? Did some people know? Were there repercussions? In what way did it impact your life?
100%. It's had a huge impact on me. So, when I was younger, obviously my mother was so traumatized by what she'd been through. And I look at it, now as a trauma. Back then as a child, I used to think, why do you behave like you do? Why do you make these decisions? And, she was just so fixated and almost sort of leaned in on the sordid side of Ruth and tried to sort of emulate that sort of like a mother, like daughter. And she had so much going for her. And this was sort of my frustration with her growing up. She was so beautiful, so charismatic. She had a wonderful network of friends and she was so loved, but she just led a life of chaos. And, that for me impacted me in so many ways because I just didn't want to be associated with the type of lifestyle that she led. And I would get picked on in the school playground and called names. And I was just so, as I grew up, I was just so petrified of people judging me because of who my grandmother was and who my mother was. I just carry this big sort of burden, this secret and shame.
And so does today's announcement remove all that for you?
100%, because as a family, we now have been given permission to think about what life could have been like for us if Ruth had been reprieved. My mother would never have led the life she did if Ruth had survived. Ruth had been given a reprieve and, ultimately 90% of women in the 20th century were reprieved. But Ruth, she was on trial for so much more than what she'd done.
And there will be people listening to you who have absolute sympathy for you. Why should you suffer? Why should your siblings suffer for something that's nothing to do with you? But they will also be thinking, a man did die. He was shot dead.
Correct. She killed somebody, fact. And she admitted it. But what we now know is that in her trial, none of the trauma, none of the abuse that she suffered was presented properly in court. Her trial lasted just over a day. The jury took, I think, 14 minutes to find her guilty. She was executed 3 weeks later. There was no appetite to save her, yet all the evidence that was submitted into the application for her pardon was all there. Her medical records, extensive evidence to show the suffering and the abuse that she suffered. She was abused by her father, she was abused by her first husband, then abused by David. That was a traumatized woman on the stand. She'd recently suffered a miscarriage. He'd beaten her so badly. She was miscarrying. There's so much more that we now realise that she should never have been executed for what she did.
Laura Enston, granddaughter of Ruth Ellis, speaking about that conditional pardon and also the generational trauma that still is being felt in her family. She was speaking to Jane Hill. That's it from this edition of NewsHour. From me, Tim Franks, and the team here in London, thanks very much for your company.